This is no longer the beginning of revelation when the Prophet ﷺ was intimidated or impacted by Jibril alayhi salam by way of fear. Now you're at a point where the Prophet ﷺ misses Jibril alayhi salam. In fact, he asks Jibril when he takes a long time to come to him, when he doesn't visit him as frequently, why is it that you don't come to me as often? وَمَا نَتَنَزَّلُ إِلَّا بِأَمْرِ رَبِّكَ. And the answer comes from the heavens that the angels are not allowed to descend. Jibril alayhi salam is not allowed to descend except by the command of the Lord. Otherwise, Jibril alayhi salam would always be with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because Jibril loved the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam loved Jibril alayhi salam. Now, if you're in Medina and you're around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you knew when Jibril alayhi salam was coming to him, even outside of revelation, because of the reaction that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have. Here we are in the last 10 nights, and you're hoping that you're one of those blessed people that would receive the mercy of your Lord, and that the angels will come to your home, and particularly amongst them will be Sayyidul Malaika, will be the chief of the angels, Jibril alayhi salam. Now, the impact of that religiosity on you is to increase you in two things. قَلِيلًا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ مَا يَهْجَعُونَ وَبِالْأَسْحَارِ هُمْ يَسْتَغْفِرُونَ وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ مَعْلُومٌ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. Right? It's supposed to increase you in praying at night, increasing in istighfar, seeking forgiveness, and increasing in charity. Now imagine the impact on the Prophet ﷺ when Jibreel alayhi salam was visiting him every single night in Ramadan. We already know what the qiyam of the Prophet ﷺ was like in the nights of Ramadan, that he would stay up all night alayhi salatu wasalam, especially in the last 10 nights. But what was the impact on the Prophet ﷺ during the day? Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, he says, كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود الناس. He said the Prophet ﷺ was the most generous of all people. And he would become even more generous in Ramadan, حين يلقاه جبريل, when Jibril alayhi salam would meet him, and Jibril alayhi salam used to meet him every night in Ramadan to revise the Quran with him, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And Ibn Abbas radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma says that when that would happen, the Prophet ﷺ's generosity would become كَالرِّيحِ الْمُرْسَلَةِ, like a hurricane of generosity. So let's first start with أَجْوَدِ النَّاسِ, that the Prophet ﷺ was the most generous of people, and connect that to what we've already talked about with the Prophet ﷺ, and specifically what it means here. The Prophet ﷺ was the living example of a person who gives with their right hands in a way that their left hand doesn't even know it, right? That means that the right hand gives with such openness that the left hand can't restrain it, and the right hand gives with such sincerity that no one else sees it, and the only person who would know it is the one that's impacted by your generosity. Well, in the case of the Prophet ﷺ, everyone was impacted by his generosity, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he had an open hand and an open heart, and you would have thought that he can't get more generous than he already is. Anas ibn Malik radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, he said that there was this man that came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he kept on asking the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ kept on giving him, to the point that he went back to his people and he said, "Oh my people, embrace Islam, for this man Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gives wala yakhsha al-faqr, and he's not afraid of poverty. The man has no fear of poverty sallallahu alaihi wasallam." And you'll see this, that the Prophet ﷺ would do this, especially with those whose hearts needed to be attracted to Islam a little bit further, the previous enemies of the Prophet ﷺ. So Safwan ibn Umayyah, for example, who the Prophet ﷺ gave 100 camels, and then another 100 camels, and then another 100 camels, until it was 300 camels in total. And you'll see that Bilal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who suffered alongside the Prophet ﷺ, he describes these moments that when the Prophet ﷺ would get something, he would immediately try to dispose of it sallallahu alaihi wasallam in charity, to a point that sometimes Bilal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu would get tired because of how often he was trying to run with the charity of the Prophet ﷺ and give it to those that the Prophet ﷺ had dictated it be given to. Abu Dharr radiyallahu ta'ala anhu says that the Prophet ﷺ said, "If I had gold equal to the mountain of Uhud, it would not please me that any of it remain in my possession for more than 3 nights, except for that which I would need to be able to repay my debts." Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he preferred sallallahu alaihi wasallam to keep on giving and giving and giving and giving. Umar ibn Khattab radiyallahu ta'ala anhu recounts this beautiful incident with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that this man came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he asked him to give him something. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam looks around and he has nothing, right? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam doesn't want to send him off without anything. So the Prophet ﷺ tells him, he says, look, I have nothing left, but go ahead and purchase what you need on my expense. And when I get something, then I'll go ahead and I'll pay it off. So he's even giving people credit, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he doesn't have anything to give at the moment. Now, obviously, Umar radiallahu anhu sees this and he doesn't want the Prophet ﷺ to be burdened with this. So he says, Ya Rasulullah, I'll take care of it. Allah has not burdened you with what is beyond your means. And the Prophet ﷺ showed in his face that he didn't like those words that Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said. And then a man from the Ansar said, Ya Rasulullah, anfiq wa la takhaf min dhil arshi iqlala. O Messenger of Allah, give and do not fear from the Lord of the throne any type of poverty. So Rasulullah ﷺ smiled and he was clearly pleased with the Ansari's words over the word of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And he said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, bihadha umirt. This is what I was commanded to do. So you could not get more generous than the Prophet ﷺ already was. And if you saw the Prophet ﷺ in his normal behavior, then you would think it doesn't get any better than this. But حين يلقاه جبريل. But when he saw Jibril alayhi salam, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam even exceeded standards that he had set for himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the scholars mention something so beautiful about this. They say that when you have a righteous friend, when you have a righteous person in your presence, when you look at them, they remind you of Allah. When you have a righteous companion, when you're around them, you want to do more righteous deeds. So when the Prophet ﷺ would look at Jibril alayhi salam, when he would accompany Jibril alayhi salam, it was like having that righteous companionship where you wanted to be inspired to do more. And that was the impact that the Prophet ﷺ had on everybody else around him.
صلوا عليه صلوا عليه صلى الله عليه وسلم